Hello, and welcome to Split Your Head. I'm your host, Bob, and today's special guest is Dr. Ethan Lyon. My first guest with a PhD in film, so officially the smartest person I've ever had on here. I connected with Ethan over Letterboxd, where he's known for writing articulate and inspiring analysis on a wide range of films. He's also been making regular appearances on podcasts like Autism Through Cinema, Caliber 9 from Outer Space, and Watch This List. So with his powerful insight, English heritage, and passion for cinema, it only made sense for him to come on Split Your Head and talk about British horror. Ethan selected 5 titles for us to discuss, opting for some lesser-known films like Walter Summers' The Dark Eyes of London from 1939, Arthur Crabtree's Horrors of the Black Museum from 1959, John Gilling's The Plague of the Zombies from 1966, and John Mackenzie's Apaches from 1977. We'll be then capping it all off with quite possibly one of the greatest British horror films of all time, Clive Barker's 1987 masterpiece, Hellraiser. So let's get on with it. Ethan, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, Bob. Thank you very much for having me. This is, it's a real treat to be here. It's a real treat.
The pleasure is mine, yeah.
No, well, the pleasure is mutual, shall I say. I mean, we've known each other now, I'd say, at least a year, and we've been thinking about doing this for at least a year. Circumstances last year obviously meant that I couldn't because I was finishing the PhD, because I may have a PhD, but it's not that new. I mean, it's not that old. I only got it in December, I'd say, is when I actually passed it. And since then, I've just kind of... Oh, go on.
You were telling me just before we started recording a bit about your whole thesis. Do you mind elaborating a bit? Because it sounds fascinating to me.
Well, sure. I'd be happy to. So the basic idea of it is talking about autism, especially the lived experience of autism. So what it feels like to be on the spectrum and sort of interact with day-to-day occurrences, and then how that comes through, or rather how you can find sort of like a visual expression of it in older horror films. For me, the Gothic horror films of the 30s to the 60s was really what sort of resonated with me, because obviously that's an era where you can't be as graphic as we are today, or indeed as some of the films that we've had on Split Your Head. And so we've you've got to have a lot of things which are more inferred. So it's often more about madness, duality, the idea of slowly going insane, that sort of thing, where your mind is meant to make it significantly more scary than it actually is. And so for me, I think as somebody who was diagnosed later in life, in my sort of mid-20s, just before I started my PhD, actually, for me, it was a case of seeing and using horror as like an understanding tool. Because often when you're overwhelmed, on the spectrum, you can't really articulate yourself. It's just like a wall of sensation just blocks out any sort of ability to say anything. So you cry or you scream or you sort of shut off. But these sorts of horror films provide to me some sort of very real understanding. The closest I've felt to having sort of myself represented on screen. And it's often in characters like Frankenstein's monster, or indeed Frankenstein in the Cushing films, characters like Maxwell in Dead of Night, which is another amazing British horror film. And it was sort of using a variety of different techniques to look at that. So it was looking at the Gothic and sort of Gothic history and Gothic art. And Gothic literature. You had sort of medical analysis, understanding of what autism was, when that came from, what are the sort of elements from there, histories of production. So a lot of the knowledge that you'll hear me spout about Hammer and the Anglo Amalgamated comes from that work. It was this really sort of complex mixture of different things that sort of came together in this one project, which I'm still sort of passing out in various ways. I'm working on turning it into a monograph, which will be a few years in the making. So that will be able for people to buy. I'm working on a chapter of that being disseminated in a book, like an edited collection, which will be sooner for people to buy. And I'm just doing various other projects along with it. So I've really sort of taken horror to my heart, I think is the best way to phrase it, even though that was never really... I was not a horror fan at all pre-16. Like, I would not watch a horror film before I was 16 years old.
Yeah, well, horror, I mean, and I'm saying this as someone that doesn't know a lot about autism, but, from hearing you explain it now, horror does seem like the best genre for explaining what the experience is like, because horror seems to have this heightened like prioritization of the presentation of a film. So things like the score, the way it's shot, the cinematography, the lighting, the pacing, the editing, all those elements are more considered generally. And I think this was something that Carol Clover touched on in her book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws. It's funny, I always bring this up and then I've tried to find the page again and I can't, but I could have sworn she said something about it, how through her research for writing that book, she came to the conclusion that horror does have this like added value to it, because like even the most cheapest, low budget B movie, Z grade film will still have this like heightened consideration of these elements that you wouldn't normally see in like necessarily like a low budget comedy or a low budget action film. It's such a part of like your sensations and like how your sensations are being communicated to. So to me, what you're talking about is how like your sensations are kind of more upfront before anything else. Like, would you say even before like the narrative, like in a way, sensations are kind of prioritized over the narrative?
I think in some cases, yes. I think what you've touched on there is very important to stress. Is horror is obviously a genre of the senses first and foremost. You quote Clover, and actually I quote Clover in my thesis because her writing is very important. But Linda Williams is another one I want to mention briefly, which is that she identifies what are known as the three body genres: melodrama, horror, and pornography, all of which are about sensation in one way and sort of being surrendered to the moment, whether it's the orgasm, whether it's weeping, or whether it's the scream of fear. And in some films, it's all three at once. But you get these, but it's about sort of being attuned to an emotion or a situation, really, that you understand from yourself and you understand from your sort of your own experience. And I want to sort of turn back to Clover a little bit for a second, because you mentioned, the bit I quoted in Clover was about how she recognized horror's capacity to be quite empowering for women within the matrix of what she's talking about. She's talking about female responses to slasher cinema and how that sort of can be very empowering. And I'd posit that for me, horror functions in a similar way, because it's a affirmation really of my sensitivities and my sensations, outside of any sort of like medicalized apparatus which would consider it, it's not good enough, it's too it's over the top, it's excessive, it's wrong, it's pathologized. Whereas in the horror film, it's just simply part of the fabric and the framework. And I think that's something that I've noticed in a few of your guests, as well as how, we'll put it this way, groups who may be considered marginalized, so women, for example, people of color, disabled people, queer people, have attached themselves very much to the horror and the exploitation genres, because they are, not only because they are a little bit reprehensible, but because they can be very validating. And I'm thinking of the episode that came out before we were recording this, which was Kelly's excellent one on her extreme horror work. Her sort of thoughts on, I think, especially Tumbling Doll of Flesh, which were very insightful about female loneliness and sort of the trauma of growing as a woman. There is something, I think, there in this sort of ability to reclaim, shall we say, what might have been considered offensive, schlocky, poorly made, as meaningful in some way, shape, or form. And I think that that's a very important tool for the genre.
Yeah. I think are you referring to Suicide Dolls when she was talking about that?
Well, that as well, but also Suicide Dolls
Okay.
is the one she mentions explicitly, but also she talks very sort of
Oh,
astutely
okay.
about, you're right, it is Suicide Dolls explicitly she talks about, but she also mentions Tumbling Doll of Flesh
Right, right, yeah.
and sort of the sensations that were evoked for her around that. Um,
Right.
and there's a number of those, I think, and actually Suicide Dolls is even more appropriate considering that the gentleman that she got it off, he was like, yeah, this
Yeah.
is rubbish, this was boring. And she's like, no, this is female loneliness. And it's and it's one of the things I really like on
Yeah.
Letterboxd, actually. One of the things I really love on
Mm.
Letterboxd is the side of Letterboxd I've kind of got myself attached to is this sort of more thoughtful, analytical, emotional side. And there's a multitude of people who sort of embody this, and you've had a number of them on as your guests,
Yeah.
wherein it's about taking a film which either is well known but is seen in a certain way, or is just not acknowledged at all, or is reviled, and is shown to us in a way, to us the reader, in a way that makes us think, oh, I feel like I should re-see this. And some of the nicest comments I've
Mm.
gotten on my own work has been about that. I mean, you and I have had discussions on Longlegs and sort of
Mm-hmm.
the narrative elements around that. That's one of them. But a number of sort of the reviews I did when I was doing my thesis, especially the ones that touched more on my own personal experiences, those have often gotten a lot of very positive responses in terms of making people rethink horrors that were less well known or less well regarded. So I will always go to bat for Straitjacket, the Joan Crawford, William Castle film, because I think that's a genuinely brilliant film about trauma and about mental illness and about
Mm.
being and stigma. And I think that's a far better
Mm.
film than it's been given credit for. Other ones as well that I could probably mention. I think the original Mystery in the Wax Museum kind of sort of falls
Okay.
into a similar format. I think Fulci, again, I think Fulci's cinema is, especially The Beyond, they're genuinely very smart films, and there's not a lot of respect given to their narrative structure, especially The Beyond.
Mm.
And there's just, for me, it's just a real pleasure in not only being able to sort of like see it myself, but see it in others and have these back and forths where I can talk
Definitely,
to them about
yeah.
it. So either on podcasts like this or just in comments or in emails. And it really is a sort of a very positive experience for me to be part of this sort of community. It's a really nice experience to be in, as I think you've probably felt yourself.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. What a lot of what you're talking about reminds me of something that I was trying to articulate to Seth Troyer on the episode that I had him on
God
earlier.
bless Seth.
Yeah. But there was something I was talking about and why, I'm so drawn to when I watch a film, more drawn to like the atmosphere necessarily over something like the narrative. And it's because of it makes me think about trying to communicate what you went through in a dream. And so, how you have a dream, you try to tell like a friend, oh, it was so terrifying. I went to a grocery store and I couldn't find my mom. And then it turned out my mom was a clown hiding behind an aisle of cereal. And your friend will be like, that's hilarious. But then you're trying to explain like, no, it was terrifying. And it's because there's these elements to the dream that you can't articulate.
Yes.
And I think that that's something that I'm drawn to when I watch a film is these elements that you can't articulate that are, as you were saying earlier, it's almost all about the sensations and how the sensations are almost more informed than the actual like textual narrative,
Yes.
like the dialogue, the plotting, everything. There's something that comes out of the whole experience.
I mean, at least 3 of the films that we're going to talk about today have those moments for me. Our finale, Hellraiser, there's a few scenes in that which still, I mean, I get goosebumps thinking about them because they are just perfect. They are perfect moments of cinema. They're perfect moments of atmosphere. And there's just a sort of there is a sense of sensual pleasure to it, which I think is incredibly important. And sensual here does not mean erotic, although in some horror contexts that can, I mean, there are certain films that really achieve this sort of weird mixing. I'd almost say Possession gets there, but that is an odd one to mention. I think Giallo is perhaps the most successful at mixing the two, something like Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward. As yes, you've got a T-shirt on from one of my favourite directors, actually. My favourite. I mean, Curse of the Scorpion's Tail is one of my favourites by him. I think it's a superb film and very.
Oh, it's so much fun.
It's just a good, meaty detective film. And I think for me, there is, it's not just this sort of pleasure erotically, but this pleasure of feeling something. And I think for me, who went through a lot of my early life not being able to feel much for whatever reason, and has gradually become more and more comfortable with his own capacity for emotion in whatever sense that may take, horror was a very important sort of almost a cattle prod. And it's the reason I got into horror was because it was an emotional prodding, shall we say. And it's kind of remained that way ever since, I'd argue.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think for a lot of us into horror, it's generally like the catharsis, right? And so I feel like the cattle prod is almost like catharsis, but in a going at it from a different direction. But we should get into these British horror films, because I feel like we were veering into Italy for a second there.
The Common Market was well done.
Yeah. So the first film we watched, we're starting with the earliest one, Walter Sommer's Dark Eyes of London, aka The Human Monster from 1933, which was Bela Lugosi starring film. It almost seemed like Bela Lugosi as the like gimmick in a way.
No, he's exactly that.
Okay.
This is the reason I wanted to talk about it. I chose this because I wanted to do a pre-war British horror, because there's not a lot of them. The British were very censorious when it came to horror films in the 20s and 30s. We didn't really have a horror market. This is why Hitchcock and things like The Lodger are still kind of pushed as being horror adjacent, even though they're more thrillers.
Right.
Because the censorship board would not allow it. The BBFC would just not allow it. Well, what is now the BBFC would not allow it. And a lot of films were slapped with what they called the H. And for you Americans, I know you pronounce it a different way, but the H for horror was how they were sent out. Yeah, you see, this is the thing, English accents. And so the problem was that a lot of them were either cut to ribbons. So Frankenstein was quite badly cut, or they were banned outright. So Island of Lost Souls was never shown here, because it was seen as immoral and sickening. And it's certainly one of the more graphic pre-code horrors. But the thing is that we were not good with this sort of material. And so when you come to like 39, when you get things like Dark Eyes of London, you're kind of having to deal with these very restrictive censorships, and you're having to smuggle horror in through the back door, usually with a big name star. So in the early 30s, Karloff came home, made The Ghoul, but in 39, they got Lugosi over to do a tour of Dracula. And he did a couple of tours of Dracula and was very, very successful. And they got him in to make this. And it's entirely a gimmick. It's entirely about the fact that it's Lugosi. He's on British soil. Mm-hmm. He's being evil in England. And you're watching...
And he's looking right at the camera.
And he's looking right at the camera, and he's doing the whole eyes thing, and he's doing the
right.
He's doing the voice and everything. And the plot is extremely convoluted. It's based on an Edgar Wallace book, which I don't think is still in... I don't think is in print still. But it's... So the basic plot is a policeman and his American friend and his American counterpart investigate a series of mysterious deaths of bodies floating in the Thames, which is something Hitchcock would later use in Frenzy, all of which have had insurance policies taken out against them by this particular company, which is run by Dr. Orloff. And I'm not going to lie, watching this now, thinking about the fact that he's Dr. Orloff and the fact that Jake is like this sort of heavily made up, mutilated assistant, did make me wonder if Jess Franco stole bits from this for his first horror.
Oh,
because
maybe, yeah.
because the awful Dr. Orloff, I mean, that's a surgical horror. This is very much sort of insurance horror, which in itself, I mean, insurance is pretty horrific anyway. But it's a far more tame experience. But
Hmm.
the thing which sort of interests me constantly about Dark Eyes is first is Lugosi, and it's his performance, which is he's playing two roles at once. He's playing Orloff, but he's also playing this owner of like a home for the blind.
Okay, yeah.
And it's a bizarre place where it's another piece of really interesting disabled history, which was that in the days before the welfare state and disability benefits, such as they are, the disabled were effectively forced to fend for themselves. So they'd be beggars on the street often. They'd be in workhouses, or they'd be places like here, where what they're doing is they're doing basic manual labor. And the film has like this very uncritical attitude towards what is effectively slave labor of these disabled people, which is just they're going through, they're making all these objects. They don't really have much of a life outside of work and meals. But there's the scene where it's like Orloff takes his last victim into the sort of the place, and he's like, yes, we give them all work, so it gives them more sort of dignity and sort of self-empowerment. And you're like, yeah, sure, but they're still kind of like in this awful like factory, like pushing wheels around. And if you've seen White Zombie, which again also stars Lugosi, I mean, that's about zombies being forced to sort of turn sugar plantation machinery. And there's something weirdly quite similar about what they're doing in relation to, for me, in relation to sort of, again, this idea that the disabled have almost a secondary class. And Jake obviously is one member of that class, the hulking individual who is
right,
who is obviously Orloff's understudy.
And I guess this will all come up again when we talk about the Plague of the Zombies.
Very much so. Very, very much so. It's
yeah.
There's a few themes that you'll see coming up through all five of the films, and definitely class relations is a big one of them. I would argue through, I'd say, at least 4 or 5 of them.
Right. Well, I mean, Hellraiser not really being a part of this, but you mentioned the censorship that was happening in Britain. That's been kind of a huge issue. Immediately made me think of the video nasties and that whole kind of craze that happened, and it was in the late 70s and 80s. And maybe it seems like British horror kind of struggles with sadism, the idea of someone basically I think I said this as a joke in one of my reviews, but killing someone just for the fun of killing them, because with Dark Eyes of London, it's all like this insurance policy scam. Yeah. And then as we go into the other films, there's all these like ulterior motives that really have nothing to do with the actual like pleasure of killing someone. Do you know what I mean? And it's I'm wondering if that's kind of like a common issue with the censorship in England of not indulging in that, like it pretty much isn't until we get to Peeping Tom, which I'm kind of jumping the gun here, but we actually see someone, and correct me if I'm wrong, if this did actually exist in other British horror films, but the idea of someone just enjoying killing people, which to me is the most terrifying motive.
So the easiest way to say that is that the English have always had an issue with sadism. You're quite right. But it's an issue with sadism in all media. I think with the horror film, I think it's the most obvious because it's the most blatant. It's the most open, shall we say. It's the most direct and disturbing as much as it's visual, it's on screen. But I think that if you trace things back to sort of the scandalous Gothic novels of Walpole and Radcliffe, you can see sort of a fear of sadism and a sort of an excitement by it, but also a repulsion of it, which we're going to get to when we get to Horror of the Black Museum. And so there's and then even I'd say something like The Man in Grey, which is a Gainsborough melodrama made a couple of years after Dark Eyes of London, which has James Mason whipping a woman to death for very ill for sort of reasons of revenge. There's a fascination I think between cruelty. I think between cruelty and sort of pleasure, and I think that happens in a lot of societies. But I think the societies wherein, and feel free to correct me if you feel this is wrong, where I think that sexuality is either repressed or it's put under very strict moral guidance, where this eruption happens, especially within the horrific. So America, for example, the series of Ruffies, and the way that sexuality is depicted there. But I'd also say the Pinku films and the Japanese erotica, where a lot of S&M appears. And this is not a comment on the moral values or the moral systems of respective countries. What I'm saying is that when social conformity is an essential part of existence, which within England often comes from a very structured class system, you get this interest. You get these sort of like libidinal energies going out in all these weird directions that the censors, who are usually the upperclassmen, the people who've been to the fancy unis, want to stamp out in some way, shape or form, because they feel it's not morally right. So that's why you get things like Islands of the Lost Souls being banned, or when like moments of horror happen, they seem so utterly absurd, like in Dark Eyes of London, I think, with the electrocution near the end, which is a wild.
Was that
scene.
in Dark Eyes of London?
Where he straps the electrodes to the Lugosi straps the electrodes to the blind man's head, and says something to the extent of, you can't see, but you can hear, and that will not do. And he shocks this poor man into oblivion, who is obviously Jake's best friend. And so these are the sort of moments where they seem funny now, they seem quite cute now, almost a little bit sort of, but within their context, they were terrifying. And that's something which we're going to get to when we talk about Black Museum in particular, and that rash of horror from the 50s in particular, and sort of the real issues that come around censorship. But I think you're right about sadism and the real issue with it.
Yeah, almost like if you show too much of sadism on screen, you're sort of implicating the audience in the like possible enjoyment of it.
Precisely.
As opposed to just saying, hey, it's meant to be scary and you're supposed to be scared by this.
Yes.
And you are an adult, so you should be able to make those decisions on your own.
Exactly. And you have to also have to consider that this is the country of Jack the Ripper.
That's true.
Who is arguably the figure who reinvented the serial killer for the modern age. A lot of the narrative, because I did a lot of research on him. It never appeared in my thesis, but I did a lot of research on the Ripper case and how it was then sensationalized. And one of the important things is how elements of class, elements of sex, especially sort of, it wasn't even they were seen as sex workers, the women who were killed, even though actually they likely weren't. You've got these competing narratives going on, which sort of aim to accentuate the gruesome goriness. And this is also in the line of the penny dreadfuls and the cheap dime novels as well that were being churned out in the 19th century. We have in Britain a very rich history of horror, but we're also very ashamed of it, I think is the best way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is based on just what little I do know of British horror, but a lot of it is sort of like mystery based. Is that right?
Yeah, a number of them are. I'd say, especially in the 60s when Hammer takes a lot of influence from Le Diabolique, it becomes a lot more in that sort of vein of like either gaslighting horror, because gaslighting is obviously comes from an English play. You've got old dark house stories. It's always more about sort of we call them harmless scares more than like explicit depictions of sadism as we get in something like Dark Eyes of London, where it's Lugosi is just perfectly happy to bump people off, or to watch them get drowned, effectively, or
right, yeah,
or to stick electrodes on a blind man's head.
Yeah.
It's this very sort of carnivalesque, I think is the best way to put it, carnivalesque attitude towards horror that is very English to me. Anyway.
I think for me, I view it as spectacle, and I feel like horror is such a genre built on spectacle. It's pretty much, how do we get from one spectacle to another to some degree. And maybe that is narrative or atmosphere or whatever. But you mentioned Lugosi electrocuting the guy, and I guess I forgot about that, but it was because there was a much more exciting electrocution kill scene in Horse of the Black Museum.
Yes, which we should actually move on to. We should move on to it.
That was my way of segueing into
good.
that.
That was next. I was just about to segue in a different way.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. This is a film. I first saw it when I was like 20. I didn't like it. I thought it was absolute garbage.
Okay.
And then I rewatched it, and I was more and more intrigued by it. And by this time I've watched it, I really like this film. I think it embodies a lot of the issues with British horror and in British cinema in general during the period. But I think it also tells us so much about English identity and very English fears about a number of subjects that come up. And it also has, I think, probably I'd say my second or third favourite, probably my second favourite performance in the 5 films we've got here today. And that's Michael Gough as Bancroft, who is sensational. I love him as Bancroft. It's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, he's great. Yeah. There was something about this one that of all the ones that you recommended, maybe outside of Hellraiser, it felt the least British to me. And maybe that's because, the American detective was in Dark Eyes of London. My bad. But
you're not too far off though, because this was made. So this was made by a company called Anglo Amalgamated. Which was Herman Cohen, who obviously went off and did various films in America. I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, I think is one, and I was a Teenage Werewolf. He did a lot of the B-movie stuff.
Cool.
And somehow, with the way that the British film industry worked by the end of the decade, what happened was it became very easy for Americans to come over and put money into British films. So Cohen made 3 films as part of Anglo Amalgamated. This, Peeping Tom, and one I didn't choose but I really like called Circus of Horrors. And so what you get is this interesting amalgamation of British and American, which is again sort of colonial. Shall we say? I was going to say colonial relations, but that's very. But yes, Anglo-American relations.
I wouldn't disagree.
Well, Anglo-American relations are a thing that comes up a lot in these films, and I think this is the one where it's the most subtextual, because it's about it's an American and a Brit working together on what is effectively a series of horror set pieces for 80 minutes. But what set pieces? Just the most amazingly arcane murders ever known. They are fabulous.
Yeah, I think the very first scene where the woman opens she takes the binoculars out and then they stab her in the eyes. From that point on, I was like, okay, I want to see what this film is all about, because I want this to be good, And I think that's why any kind of things that normally would, put me off about these types of films, I kind of just I cast it aside a bit, And I actually did enjoy the characters quite a bit, which I maybe struggled with a bit with Dark Eyes of London and Plague of the Zombies, but the characters in Horrors of the Black Museum were great. Like the journalist, you said Bancroft, that's his name, right?
Yes, Edmund Bancroft.
Right. He was great. His assistant had a really bizarre relationship. Everyone involved was great.
The woman who plays his girlfriend, Rick.
Yeah.
So for reference, this journalist, his name is Edmund Bancroft. He writes about crime. That's all exclusively what he writes about. He has an assistant, sort of a helper, who is conducting a secret relationship with this young woman whose name I can't remember, but the actress is Peggy Ann Eaton. I believe I've got that name right, but she would later on appear in Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. She went on to do actually she's got a small but fairly good filmography, except here where she's truly awful. It's one of the worst performances. It's so wooden. It's as if she's just learned her lines.
In a way,
it's awful for me.
But to be honest, to be transparent about it, I don't really watch a lot of films from before the 60s. And I find that one of the reasons is because the acting I do find a little hard to get into at times. And it's not even that I can't fully enjoy those films per se, but I find I have a hard time engaging with it in a critical stance, because like something like The Bad Seed, for instance, my wife loves that film. I know it's considered a classic, but every time I watch it, it's the performances really keep me at a distance, Well,
this is interesting, because this is something I'd like to actually address. For me, I actually find these performances, which for many people are very stilted, they're very of a theatrical bent, I find them actually really quite refreshing, because they're very openly emotional. They're very direct and dramatic about what's going on. It's all very heightened. And for someone who likes very clear expression without subtext, and also just lives in a very intensely emotional state, I connect with it on a way that I don't think was intended, but really works, which is why I think I find Michael Gough's performance just so... It is scenery chewing, and he does this a lot in these sorts of like horror films of that era. He kind of just goes wild.
Yeah.
But he plays Bancroft with such a pleasure, not just playing him, but the character having pleasure, because this is, full spoilers, this is a gentleman who deliberately engineers really arcane murders, first of people he doesn't know, and then somebody who he kind of has a relationship with, but it's not really worth much. And so he does these sort of bizarre murders, and he does them by remote control, effectively. He hypnotizes his assistant to go and do them. And they have these... So there's like... I won't give them all away, but obviously the first one which comes to mind is the binoculars, which needs to be seen. I would say if you're a horror fan, you should see the horror. You should see that there is one involving, as Bob said, a death ray, effectively, a massive electrical.
Yeah.
And then what they do to him afterwards is just amazing. That's just like
yeah.
That's
the
that
acid
for me is
bath?
always the acid bath, which is, again, is a very classically British thing. There was a murderer in the late 40s called John George Hay, who was known as the acid bath murderer, who murdered old women for their money and then dissolved them in baths of acid. And I can't help wondering if that's like a sly sort of nod to that. But Bancroft's thing is that he derives intense pleasure from these murders. The idea of them, and then the idea of them being seen and talked about in inspiring conversation, to the point where his doctor is actively concerned for his like physical health, because he collapses every time. And it's bizarre because no human being on earth would experience this. But it's so utterly fascinating to watch this figure experience sensation in such a way that it shuts him off, effectively. And I think for me, there's always something, I think as I've gotten older, that's something which has really stayed with me about Bancroft, is this sort of monomania towards effectively the seeking of pleasure, which in itself is quite a Hellraiser concept. So yeah, I find these sorts of performances really actually very engaging, and always probably will.
No, I don't know if, because you said it wasn't necessarily what they're intended for, those types of over the top performances. I just think it's a matter of coming from stage acting, where you have to be able to broadcast these emotions and this narrative to the farthest back of the auditorium or the theater or whatever. So it just makes sense then that translating that to film, it would just be, this is, the quickest, easiest, loudest way of communicating these things, and maybe to my taste, then I've always preferred, the in-between emotions, the in-between communications, the awkward silences, the like stumbling over words, things like that. I love like the messiness of communication.
It's quite Cassavetes,
which is probably evident from me doing this show, like
well, I think
talking over
also,
you right there.
One of the nice things as well is that, to be honest, I don't mind that because it's a conversation and this is what it's meant to be.
Yeah.
The other thing that comes to mind as well is that a number of these actors were stage actors originally. I think a lot of them got their start in stage. So Michael Gough was one. Jeffrey Keane, who would then go on to play characters in the Bond franchise. He was a stage actor. You've got, I'm pretty sure the woman who plays Aggie is a stage actor as well. You've got a sort of a whole plethora of Brits, basically, slumming it on film, because for a long time, film was considered very much a second-rate art form in Britain, and it was, if you were a theatre actor, you did films on the side, and you didn't really talk about it. So John Gielgud talks about that, has talked about that in the past. So you do get these very brash, bombastic performances, which I really like. And there's no room for an awkward pause here. It's all, well, Aggie, you've beaten me here. This sort of like, ice tongs and everything. But to me, that's a really comfy place for me. It's why I like Hammer as well.
Oh, cool. Okay. Yeah. Huh. But you probably, I'm guessing, like grew up watching a lot of these films, and maybe you're more accustomed to this acting too. Oh, okay.
Well, this is the thing, is that, as I said at the start, I didn't really get into film or indeed horror cinema until I was about 16. And my experience beforehand was, by and large, because it was my parents who introduced me to films, and my father in particular, who was a massive film fan. So we were a household of Die Hard, of Speed, of Cliffhanger, of Hunt for Red October, Crimson Tide, that sort of like 80s and 90s action. Boom was really what was sort of de jure in the household. And it was me discovering the book 1001 Films to See Before You Die that made me realize that cinema was something very much beyond just popcorn. And that's what really got me into cinema to begin with, more, shall we say, art cinema, because I was an art cinema fan before I was a horror fan. So I watched things like 400 Blows, Amarcord, Seventh Seal. I did the whole gamut really of like classic cinema. And then about 16, 17, I decided to try horror. And it was pretty much a case of, well, if I'm scared by this, in theory, what's it like in practice? And so I started often with newer films, or newer-ish. I think the first one I ever remember watching was Sisters, the De Palma. Which is, again, a splendid film. But I didn't become more interested in older horror films, I would say, until my early 20s-ish. And then I became a lot more interested, I think, in classic cinema as my sort of the time went on. And I sort of became aware of how sort of classical Hollywood, classical British films express themselves, both narratively and sort of performance-wise. And then it was just sort of a case of when it came to watching things like Horror of the Black Museum, Dracula, the Chris Lee, it just sort of that motion became just so natural to me. But yeah, it was not something I grew up on at all. I was never a horror fan at all, I would say, which is quite surprising, really. I'd say. In fact, I'd say I'm probably coming up for my 10-year anniversary of watching horror.
Wow. You've gotten a lot of work done in these 10 years because you've seen all the big ones. You've seen all the classics. You know so much about it.
Most of them. There's a lot I've not seen still. There's a lot I've not seen. And that's something I'm trying to rectify, to be honest, because my natural instinct has always been to go into the odder and the more unusual, which is obviously why I chose these 5. Because for me, it's always been a case of those films are always going to be there, the big ones, the Santa Sangres, the Black Swans, Funny Games, stuff like that. They're always going to be there. They're always going to be well known and appreciated. But there's so much that's not well known and not appreciated that I feel there's more interest there for me to sort of really dig deep. And and I think that for as long as I've been on Letterboxd, I've been on Letterboxd 5 years now, I would say. I would say that during that time, I've definitely become more known for watching these sorts of horror films and having like a fantastic rate of it. But it's as much been a sort of a learning experience as like a casual watch. It's combining work and pleasure effectively, which is what Bancroft does, to be fair.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
That's very true.
But I was partly wanting to, ask you about that because, you did pick The Plague of the Zombies, which is a Hammer film. And I've found from talking to people through Letterboxd that Hammer horror is something that a lot of people grew up on. And it's, for me, trying to get into it over the years, I've always kind of struggled because it seems like something you do need to grow up on. But as you said, you've really only started watching Hammer horror in the past 10 years or so.
Yeah. Hammer is an interesting one. It's good we move on to Plague of the Zombies. Hammer is an interesting one. There is always, I sense, a lot of Hammer, to my mind, is not actually that scary anymore. It's very much made of its time. So the late 50s, when The Curse of Frankenstein came out, and then Dracula, which was basically a 1-2 punch that kickstarted a resurgence of horror cinema, to be frank, after a long sort of fallow period. And these are films that are still in that sort of Black Museum register, very sort of, I suppose you used the word in your review, and I think it's actually a really fair word, stuffy. Sort of British, sort of. No, but it's a fair word to use because what a lot of it invokes is a very specific English background, a very specific English culture.
Sure.
Around class, around manners, around taste, and if you are not somebody who's grown up in that milieu, it's not. You don't get it basically, and I think you can enjoy it, and you can enjoy the decadence of it, as people like Scorsese and Dante have done. But there's a sort of there's a very inherent Englishness to it, which I actually really like, because they're almost cozy in terms of they're bits of England and people you recognise from English sort of pop culture, and it's also often dealing with very uniquely English themes. So in Plague of the Zombies, I think it's also one of the few zombie films made in England. I think the only other big one is Shaun of the Dead. This is a film about...
was it Manchester, Living Dead at Manchester Morgue? That's
which is a great film.
Right?
That is Spanish, and it's got like
it's really good,
polyglottal cast. But that's a brilliant film. I've not seen that in ages, actually. I really should go back to it. But it's great, It's operating actually in a very similar vein, which is a sort of sort of English. So Plague of the Zombies is set in an English village in Cornwall, which, for those who don't know, if you aren't English, Cornwall is sort of the southern tip of Britain. It's on the furthest southeast.
Okay.
It's quite a deprived county these days, but back in like the 19th century, it had something of a mining boom, which is what this film is often about. It's about sort of mining, especially mining for tin, which was a huge commodity at the time. And the thing which came, it obviously it then fell on hard times, and it's quite deprived these days. But the thing which and it's also got a really weird sort of expression, a sort of relationship with travel as well, because a lot of people come into Cornwall as holiday makers. It's what's sort of come over from tin is now holidays, and it's usually very rich people who do that and buy houses and force the locals out. So what Plague of the Zombies is doing is that it's playing on very uniquely English connotations. So in this case, it's like the rich manipulating the poor, using them as their sort of drone puppets effectively. It's about again, it's less about the sexuality and it's more about the fear of brainwashing and control by sort of the powers that be. And it's also about, and that comes in terms of class, in terms of sex, because there's the two women at the center of the story, but it's as main characters, but it's also about race. And this is one of the few films, or the few British horror films that even remotely approaches race as a subject. I would say in this era, it's been a lot more nuanced in more recent years. Girl with All the Gifts comes to mind, and The Power of a couple of years ago, I believe. And I'm certain people can correct me, but this is one where it's talking about Britain's colonial legacy, because the idea is that do we spoil it? Do we spoil it for them, Bob? Do we spoil what happens?
I'll put up a spoiler thing. Yeah. If people want to skip ahead, they can. You know,
big flashing spoilers.
Yeah.
Basically, what has happened is that the squire, who is the local nobility, has taken this. Has brought back from the West Indies. It's assumed to be it says it's the West Indies. I'm likely to assume it's actually Jamaica. Voodoo, voodoo practitioners who live in his mine and beat the voodoo drums and do the various voodoo black magic in order to kill workers in this very hazardous tin mine, and basically have an army of free slaves to mine as much tin as he can. And so you've got this, and there's only one black character in it, who is the squire's butler, and that character has a few lines, but he speaks with a very distinct West Indian accent. You can very clearly hear it in his inflection. And so you get a really interesting, I'd say this, and there's one segment of Dr. Terror's House of Horror where black people do actually appear within the British horror nexus, and it's quite troubling, I think, in places, really. But this is something that it is very troubling. But this is something that I think comes through a lot in British horror. Is there's certain region-specific elements to it, which I think you weren't as accustomed to, shall we say.
I wasn't accustomed to?
Yeah, because of these things to do with like Cornwall and the sort of the cultural sort of the background behind it, which is not me like sort of trying to sort of finger wag, but it's more of a reflection for me of like, this is a film for me which I really love. I think it's one of my top 5 Hammers. And I think that I like it because it attempts to do something different for Hammer, which had gotten in a bit of a rut in making Hammer and Frankenstein and Dracula films. Remind me, have you seen any of those? Yeah,
I've seen The Curse of Frankenstein, I think it was. Yeah, I think I've seen that one, and I liked it. I thought that was okay, but other than that, I'm not sure if I've seen any other Hammer horror films at all.
Really? Well, I threw you in at the deep end. I threw you in at the deep end.
You did a little bit, yeah. That's okay. Okay.
To be fair, I did that with Amy when I was on Watch This List. I got her to watch one of the sort of gaslight horror films, which was Taste of Fear. and Blood from the Mummies 2,
Okay.
both of which I consider to be top 10. But yeah, these are very sort of these are films which again have these very unusual attitudes towards not sex in this case, because there's really not any sex in Plague of the Zombies, which in itself is quite nice because it's a move away from what Hammer were getting used to, known for, which was sex and gore.
Well, wait a second. There was one scene, and okay, it's offensive to say it's a sex scene, but it's a scene that involves some level of sexuality in that the woman is accosted by the fox hunters and like dragged in the squire's house. And then they kind of imply that they were about to rape her.
Yes,
if I'm not
that's
mistaken.
A very good point. That's a very good point. Yes,
and that was the one scene in the film where I kind of felt like, oh, this is sleazy and scary, and it felt like what I was talking about earlier of that sadism that maybe Britain would have been too scared or too, I don't know what word you want to use really, but they wouldn't want to necessarily show in these films. And then I think that's why I was really surprised how the outcome was something, as I said in my review, like far more capitalist in a way, because it was just about like exploiting workers. But I guess I was being led to believe that the film was a bit more. It was going to be more about the sadism, I guess.
Yeah, I can understand that. And I think that with the sadism, I think it's important to note that while sadism does appear as the undercurrent of a lot of British horror films, when we move into the 70s in a second, that's an important thing we'll want to talk about. But within the 60s, sadism still, it's still on a sort of a down low. You're not really seeing it as much. And I see that scene more as an indication of sort of class structure, because those are rich men having their way with the local female population, which is a common theme of a lot of these, like what would be called bodice rippers, and it's indeed it's also a callback to the Hammer Hound of the Baskervilles, which includes a very similar scene right at the start to explain what happens to the original Baskerville. So for me, what it is, it's about men getting away with something because they can, and that also, that's a multi-tentacled beast, which also extends to race, in terms of keeping these people in this cellar, which in itself, we must also acknowledge, the film, I think, is at the very least quite structurally colonialist. It never really it never passes any judgment on what's happening. There's more judgment in sort of the Plague of the Zombies sister, which is the reptile, which has a lot of the same cast and crew.
Wait, what do you mean by that it doesn't pass any judgment?
Well, in as much as it refuses to sort of talk about it as a subject, it's more just sort of a narrative plot point. It's not along the lines of it saying colonialism is bad. But in that respect, it almost becomes a tacit approval of colonialism in terms of to me, it becomes almost sort of, it's almost a sort of it was just what it was, which, to be fair, considering the 19th century, the effects of colonialism were still incredibly rife within British society. We would have, by the end of the century, the empire that never, the sun never set on the British Empire, because it was just that large. And so we've still got colonialist attitudes moving all the way through, even today, to a troubling extent. But we're not at the point, I think, within British cinema where it's as talked about openly. So you get something which is like this, where it's just a plot point, and you might say that it's an object of fear more than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I am looking at it from being a Canadian and however many decades on, but to me, I thought it was shown in a bad light. I thought the exploitation of the workers was shown in a bad light. I thought that there was cultural appropriation going on. It's an interesting thing because it's okay. The film itself is appropriating another culture, but then it's also showing the characters that are the villains are also showing cultural appropriation. So it's almost like, does it
Yes,
cancel out then? You know what I mean? It's like, can it
Yeah.
wag its finger and also do the same thing? You know, it's yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we get to this point. I think this is one of the interesting things about horror and exploitation cinema, is that it's often having its cake and eating it around very sensitive social subjects.
Totally.
Race, which again is something that comes up in episodes you've talked about, you've had here before. I mean, the Findlay episode with Jetta, for example.
Right.
There's always these very interesting lines between how much is this insightful, nuanced commentary on colonialism, sexual assault, emasculation, and how much of it is just leaning into it. And certainly there are films that tread this line very carefully, or shall we say more obliquely, and then there are films that clearly just jump into the pool usually on the side of exploitation.
I think and maybe this is a bit of a cop-out to say, but I think that a lot of these films get a pass in the era when they came out is because a lot of the times they were talking about these things when no one else was at all. So it's, you know what I mean? So I think that's generally the consensus about like blaxploitation cinema, is that, well, at least these films are putting Black people as heroes. You know what I mean? It just, now we're so far removed from that. We know better. We know the resources should be more available to people of all different, races. So it's like, it's more terrible. But to look at it more in a historical lens, it's the first, stab at trying to talk about these things. And that's why you're kind of glad that it at least exists to some extent.
Yeah.
But it's difficult to talk about, for sure.
Very difficult. Something I want to say, and then this will be actually a really nice segue, is how, when it comes to British cinema, or when it comes to sort of any sort of horror cinema, to be honest, is often what survives is this ability to presage nuanced discussion, usually by depicting something as a source of anxiety. And especially in British horror, that can be race, as we could say that's race here. It could be sexual liberation, as with something like the Dracula films, because they're often seen as sort of films about the fear of female sexuality. And so you get films that attempt to talk about things in ways that society is not ready to talk about, or is poorly equipped to. What appeals to me being on the spectrum is that it's often about these are the more accurate depictions of what it feels like to be in the situation than anything that could come from Mozart and the Whale, or music, or a lot of narratives that are explicitly about autism, which are usually about what other people think autism to be.
Wow, okay.
And I think that's another appeal for pulp and trash and horror, or exploitation, if you will, is this idea that you're not submitting to sort of the smug and condescending moralizing of the dominant class, the dominant white, cis, heterosexual, neurotypical, able-bodied world, effectively. And I think that's a real reason for loving it. And I know a number of scholars who are neurodiverse, or who are queer, who are actively engaged in writing about horror cinema, whether it's slashers or sci-fi is another very popular one. I think there's a real interest there. One thing I will say is that I do think that the more recent rise in mainstream material that is at least understanding of different identities, is good for the future generations of children to come after you and I, who won't need to feel sort of the terrible sense of shame and guilt and sort of lack of knowing that people of my age and people older than me, but also a fair few younger than me, have experienced. And speaking about young people, that's a very good way that we can link to what we've got as number 4, which is
Apaches. Yeah. I just want to pause you for a sec.
Sure.
I love everything you just said. I really love what you just said. That was awesome. That was just very inspiring. And once you said, you just nailed it by saying smug. That's exactly what it is. And it's something that I've had a problem with a lot of mainstream cinema over the past decade, I would say, of trying to show representation of all different types of people and how, like, it gets me riled up, but how smug it is and how it has nothing to do with actually empowering anyone and has everything to do with making sure that they appear like they're doing the right thing. It's completely performative.
To appease the profit margins. This is something I think you and I obviously move in similar political circles. For a long time, the word woke was used as very much as like a sort of I hated the word, and I still have a sort of dislike of it, because to me it sort of denigrated what I considered to be very sincere political movements. Increasingly, I'm feeling more comfortable using it to describe this sort of raft of very smug media put together by people of, they may well have a minority identity, but a great deal of monetary capital privilege and luck, really, which they consider then to be the normality. And they try, and it's the attempt of, to me, it reads as the attempt of someone with a great deal reaching out a hand to help others, but only to help themselves, really. And that's why I find a lot of that is also very easy target material for the Shapiros of the world, because it's so gropingly insincere, and it's so unbelievably unradical that it's a really easy target, and a legitimate target, almost, I'm willing to say, in some cases, where it's like, no, you don't get a free pass and a lollipop just because you show you had an autistic person, an autistic character, or your characters are neurodiverse or non-binary. That stuff. I think that if really great representational art is being made, it's made at the corners, and it's being made in horror, and it's being made in experimental cinema, and it's being made probably in extreme cinema as well, I would argue.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah.
And it's because it's about the extremes of experience, and it's about the extremes of minority. And the only one I think that's gotten really good at it recently was I Saw the TV Glow. Is the only one I would say.
I love that movie.
That is my film of the year. That was an incredibly powerful experience, because it came from, again, it was a marginal filmmaker in Schönbrunn, making a film with a big budget and having from what I can tell, they had no restraints. They were not told, you must include this, you must include that. They were just simply allowed to create what is effectively an Ackerman film for Gen Z. And I think that's an incredibly important thing to have.
Chantal Ackerman? Okay.
Chantal Ackerman, yes. There's a real emphasis on monologue, on voice, on disconnection. And the narrative structure reminds me of an Ackerman film as well. For some reason. It just worked for me in such a way.
Yeah.
But again, it's something I'm very passionate about.
I don't know if I've actually seen any Chantal Ackerman. The big one that she directed was
Jean Dielman.
Okay, right. I wasn't 100% sure. Okay, so I actually haven't really seen that. Okay, I have it, and I need to watch it. It's just very long. But is there any
good one to watch with your wife? Good one to watch with your wife. That one. So then she can turn to you and go, "Now this is what it's like when I have to peel the fucking potatoes, Bob."
Okay, two things to that. One, I actually am the one that cuts and peels. I'm sort of the sous chef when we cook. I'm the vegetable cutter. Two, I've told this on another podcast episode about how technically her and I have seen the final half hour of the film, and we projected it on a theater screen while just before my wife performed one of her one-woman shows. She does a
Yes,
show
I've
called
seen.
Donna
Yes,
Carnivora.
yes, I saw
Okay,
the
so you
poster
know
for
about
that
it,
on her
yeah.
account. Yeah.
Right. So we did a show in a theater, and we played that as people were coming in the final half hour because we knew about what happens and it ties into her character. So we effectively ruined the film for 50 or 75 people that showed up. So yeah.
The one thing I will say with that is, before I give you a recommendation, then we'll jump into Apaches.
Yes.
The whole film it's an experience. It's not just the 30 minutes. You have to. It's the routine.
Right.
And so that's something I think you won't have missed. And I think will probably make more sense to you. The other one I really recommend is Rendezvous de Anna, which she made a couple years after, and is about a filmmaker going across Europe and the various encounters with people and the sort of the disconnection she feels from things. Very beautiful, very austere. Shall we get to Apaches?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, let's do it. So Apaches.
This is a film for me. This was the first time I'd seen Apaches, and the reason I wanted to do it was because during the 70s, the British film industry dries up. Money drops out of the sort of the system. There aren't as many co-productions anymore. Whatever co-productions are, it's mostly Bond.
Okay.
TV is really what's keeping Britain going, and even then, you're subject to strikes all the time. This is a really tough time in British life. Is the 1970s? It's a really hard time. So filmmakers, if they had to make horror, they had to be inventive. And the way that they were most inventive was in the public safety film. Now, obviously, there's public safety films in America, all over the world, but there are a small raft of British ones from the 70s and early 80s that are exceptional for their sort of like willingness to go hard, shall we say. Really intense subject matter and really unsparing. And Apaches is probably the long form version of that. It's about, it was made in the late 70s as a promotional tool, effectively to warn children about playing on farms and the dangers of farm equipment.
Okay.
And so what we see is, which is why you see this gang of 6 children, 2 girls, 4 boys, interacting with various pieces of equipment on a farm, and 5 of them end up dead in pretty brutal circumstances, it's fair to say.
Yeah.
And it does not shy away from the horror of the situation. It's very graphic. It's graphic, but not in the terms of like gory. There's only maybe what blood appears is very minimal. Rather, it's very matter of fact of what might happen. So
it's very blunt.
Very blunt. Blunt is the best word for it. So we won't go into all of them, but there are some really hard. There are some very hard to watch scenes in Apaches, especially if you're someone who has a kid. But what works about it, what makes it more horrific, I think, is the way that it's structured, because it's structured as like a ghostly voiceover. By this kid, and it's cross-cut with scenes of like a party being put together, and the kid's like, oh, I love a party, I do. Oh, you get money from adults at parties. And then and then you realize it's actually his funeral, and it's like the wake for his funeral. It's shockingly bleak stuff. But the thing which strikes me, and struck me especially on my second watch, was the format for showing that the kids have died is, so they show the kid dying, but what they do really smartly is then the impact afterwards. So it's taking the name tag off of like the coat rack, or or it's like putting all the books in the school bag and putting the bag away, or it's taking all the clothes out of the desktop of the drawer. And you sit there, and what it does is it does 2 things. It tells to the child what will happen when you die, and as much as you're going to not be there anymore, and it says that your friends won't be there. But to the parent, it basically it's every worst nightmare, because it's the feeling that your child is no longer there, and it is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost tear-inducing just talking about it like that. It's really hard material. I think I'm not sure how you did. I'm not sure what you thought about it when you saw it, or whether you saw it on your own, because it's probably best to see it on your own.
I watched it on my own, and I think you kind of gave me a basic idea of what to expect. So I think I was really struck by as you say, the narrative structure of it. Struck by the structure, but it was the part where, was it Sharon who dies from drinking the poison?
My goodness, yeah, it's like
really.
It's like turpentine, or I think it's rat. I think it's either turpentine or rat poison. I think it's more likely it's rat poison, because that often was around in those areas and will be available in the bar. But yeah, that is genuinely one of the scariest. I think that's, of all the scenes in all the films we've seen today, that's the scariest scene. That's the most heart-rending scene.
I mean, if we don't include Hellraiser, I would agree. Yeah.
Well, the thing with
Hellraiser is just on a whole other level.
This is I'll argue something, which I think that Hellraiser is high fantasy horror. Hellraiser is high fantasy, almost gothic beauty. It's a beautiful film. So whatever violence we see is within an aesthetic mode, shall we say, a very pleasant aesthetic mode.
I see what you're saying, yeah.
Apaches is not. Apaches is really blunt and brutal about, this is what happens. This is how you will die. And you will die in pain, and your friends will see it. Or sometimes you won't. Your friends won't even know where you've gone. In the second case, which is really very unsettling. It's it's stuff where you have to almost talk about it out loud to really process just genuinely how disturbing it is, because it's so mundane, I think.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Because it's accidental deaths. It's not like anyone was intending to kill these children.
No.
They all died from complete accidents, which could very well happen if you're playing around on farm equipment. And I think that's why the poisoning one really struck a chord, because it was maybe the most like innocently portrayed. It wasn't this like, someone fell and there was a big sound and you know what I mean? It was, she drank the cup of random liquid, and then they show a scene outdoor of a house, and you hear her blood-curdling scream for her mother, and that was it. But something about the scream, and I think, that's
it's
just maybe
screaming.
like specific to me, but I find like the right kind of scream can scare me more than any like visceral bit of violence or anything. Just the way someone screams can be way more terrifying. Yeah, exactly. So
it's harrowing stuff, because it's pain and fear really clearly manifested in the most sort of direct manner. And that's really, really hard to watch. It would be hard to watch for a child. It would scare the life out of you. But for an adult, it's soul ripping, because it's for an adult, for example, with a kid or someone who's predisposed towards wanting kids, that's a really terrifying moment. And I think it's one of the reasons why Apaches, while I don't think it's a perfect film, works as lethally well as it does, because it's the horror of the everyday, and it's the horror of grief. Effectively, it's about the ways in which you get to grieving and absence, and it's incredibly profoundly powerful. And things like John Krish's, John Krish, who is another filmmaker who did this sort of material. He also did an excellent British sci-fi film called Unearthly Stranger, which I highly recommend. But he did this little short film, which is a minute long. It was a safety infomercial about looking after your kids. Like, do you know where your kid is? And it's a minute long, and it counts it down. You don't know what's happening until right at the final scene, where you see that you hear a little girl being hit by a car and her mother watching. And it's this sort of material that. And then there's the most famous one is the Lonely Spirit of Water, which is Donald Pleasance.
Okay.
Basically, and it's about children not playing near water because they can fall in and they can drown. And so there's this sort of methodology of really scaring people by fictionalizing banal instances that are all too real and all too frighteningly possible, effectively scaring people straight, to be frank. I mean, that sort of shock tactic was being used right up until I was a teenager. I have some very vivid memories of having police lectures and with some incredibly graphic photos of incidents.
Oh God.
That still trouble me, if I'm honest. In places, it's still it's a potent memory for me. But you see this. I mean, it's that sort of real shock tactic material that I think makes it stands Apaches out from the rest of the films we're talking about today, because it is just so raw and terrifying.
But I will say that, like, you still have to kind of view Apaches as like, it is a film, right? But it wasn't intended to be shown for any form of entertainment. And if you think about it, it's an effective horror film, but it's not an effective PSA, because if I watched that as a kid, I wouldn't really understand what I need to be on the lookout for. Like, okay, if I go to a farm, I just won't walk around at all. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
just don't go
you
to a
can't
farm.
Really figure out. Just don't go to a farm is the only thing I would figure out. Just
stay away from farms. Yeah, which probably in the West Country is not very doable, but in like London, I mean, obviously that's the thing.
Right.
Yeah, I think I think you make a good point there as well. And I wonder how much of it was the filmmakers, because the director, John Mackenzie, would later go on to direct a couple of years later The Long Good Friday, the exceptional gangster film with Bob Hoskins. And the screenwriter, the screenplay in this, I think, is genuinely a great screenplay, because the dialogue is so natural. It's very unaffected. It's what kids would talk about, which makes it more real. So I can't help wondering whether for them it was like a case of creating these scenarios, dramatizing them, giving people the emotional impact of them, but not really saying what you should do next. Whether that was then accompanied by a lecture from a member of say safety, going, "This is what you should do here, 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 and here." I don't know. I don't know much about the history of the safety films, but because what you get is this like 30 minutes of bleakness, and then a list over the credits of all the kids who've died in the last year from various farm-related accidents. And it's about 30 names. And you do not really, and I think the youngest is 2 years old, which is one of the most shocking things in the film, is like it's a 2-year-old.
If I was a kid watching that, I would almost just interpret that as, what I just watched was real. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's it's indirect, but to me, I would say it's along the lines of, you know, how Texas Chainsaw Massacre is supposedly based on a true story, but the true story is Ed Gein, and what Ed Gein did had nothing to do with what happens in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So to me, it's like it's that whole idea of like the horror gimmick of like being so loosely based that it doesn't even really matter that much how like factual it is. It's the fact that it's clinged onto you, that what you just watched was real.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why it was as terrifying as it was, and probably as infamous as it was because it's just it feels so real. And I think for children, where the boundary between fantasy and reality is more blurred, that's well known. That would really freak you out. And I mean, the history of terrifying children's TV is worth 4 or 5 books in its own right. I can't name one off the top of my head, but that sort of stuff is out there. And so, it's lethally effective as horror. Whether it's effective as anything else is a different matter. But a film
Right,
that is
right.
very effective as horror and works on a number of levels is, of course, Hellraiser, which is
Hellraiser,
our final
yes.
pick for the day.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's interesting because I was thinking of how to segue into that and how, like, as a kid, I watched all of the Hellraiser films, but the first
mm,
one I wasn't really I liked it, but I didn't really go back to it that much. I was more into the sequels. And I think
mm.
watching the first one now as an adult, I like it the most because I think there are a lot of ideas at play that are really not for kids, you know? And not even just in the sense that they're inappropriate, but they're also just, as a kid, you just don't understand
Yeah,
desire or sexuality in that way,
yeah,
you know?
it's an incredibly mature horror film.
Definitely.
I think it's without doubt within the top echelon of British horror, which makes its existence even more remarkable because it was made during a complete dead zone of British cinema where there was very little going on. Really,
Okay.
horror was nowhere. The bottom had dropped out, and so Barker
Yeah.
effectively had to have American money come in to help make it. But what you get is this just it's such a mature film. It's so deeply invested in its characters. The character work is exceptional. Um, I'd say the three leads for me, disregarding Kirsty because she isn't much of a lead. She's more sort of a. But Julia, Frank, and I
Larry.
can't do Andrew Robinson's character. I only remember him as Andrew Robinson because because obviously he's Scorpio from Dirty Harry. He
Oh,
is,
okay.
yeah, he
It's been a
is.
while
Well, he's
since
also,
I've seen that one.
yeah.
Yeah.
Apparently, he's also in Deep Space Nine. He's he's one of the
Okay.
Cardassians.
Kardashians.
Yeah. Oh, can you imagine
Larry. He's
keeping up
Larry
with the
Kardashian.
Cardassians? Oh, good
Yeah.
grief! Keeping up with the Cardassians, ladies and gentlemen, sign me up. No, but the characters are fully realised. They have really quite depthy figure, which is something which is not really in the earlier films we've looked at today. And often
Hmm.
they're figures who are tormented by desire of one description or another. Most notably Julia, who obviously lots have been said about Julia, but to sum it up, she's somebody who really, really is a very sensual person who likes
Yeah.
who desires and is a desiring body, but is unable to get that from Larry because Larry is just not capable of it. It's like for me, it's almost as if the circuit either they don't match properly or it's just the circuit doesn't exist for Larry.
Hmm.
And then you have Frank, who is naturally the exact opposite, who is effectively everything Larry isn't. And so she's caught between these two
Yeah.
incredibly powerful poles
Wait,
of
what do you mean about Larry? Larry doesn't have desire?
what he never expresses his desire he rarely expresses his desire. And when he does, it's only really in one scene, which
Yeah, he
is
tries to have sex with her, and
well, she tries to have
she
sex with, yeah, and obviously Frank appears
right,
and,
and
and,
that's when she's
and
like,
cuts the
"No,
knife
please, I
open.
can't." Which I will say was the one scene that felt a little out of character for Larry, because she says,
Mm.
"No, please don't,"
And he
like
keeps going.
a bunch of times. And
Yeah.
up until that point, you kind of get the sense that this is like Ned Flanders or something, you know, like he's the nicest, most
He's a bit Ned
like
Flanders,
polite
yeah.
guy. Yeah, but I liked him because of that. Because I don't know, I found it believable. I kind of okay. Ned Flanders is the mean way of putting it, but I kind of got more of like a Kyle MacLachlan from Twin Peaks vibe, maybe. Like
Yeah, no, I
he's
can
just like
see
a
that.
good guy. You know what I mean?
No, I do
Um,
see what you mean. And it's funny that you say that because I've been watching clips of Sex and the City, and obviously he is in Sex and the City for a season.
okay.
So that's so for now I have there are many different Kyle MacLachlans out there, some of which are
Right.
more depraved than others. But I do see what you mean. The one thing I'll say about Larry, when I say he doesn't have desire, that's probably a little unfair on him. But
Mm.
Perhaps more accurate is he doesn't seem to be attuned to his wife's desire, like at all. It's as if it does not, it's almost it doesn't compute for him, which is why I say he has no desire. He has no understanding or appreciation for its reciprocity. When he has sex with her, it's almost entirely on his own terms.
Okay.
When they are interacting beforehand, he's only really thinking about himself, his own needs. He's got all these sort of terribly corny jokes. There is something about him which sort of feels very self-absorbed in a strange way.
Really?
To me,
Okay.
anyway. Yeah, I do find him a little self-absorbed. I mean, maybe that's, it's interesting to hear two very different opinions on what is effectively supposed to be the good guy of the film. But when I was watching it, I couldn't help thinking that he was just, I think he felt, it's almost as if he wants to be kind, but he cannot conceive of a way of doing it. It's as if he's either incapable of seeing past himself and his own desires, or he just misreads every situation so dramatically that you kind of cringe at him. And the scene, the two scenes that come to mind for that is the one where it's after the first murder, and where Julia is in her bedroom, and he's at the door,
right?
And he goes, "Would you like a cookie, little girl?" And you're like, "Why?
Yeah.
Why? Why is that? That no." And you're sort of like shaking you want to shake him. Like, why do you think this is like even remotely funny? And even at the dinner party, there's like this weird tension between the two, where she's obviously icy, but he is sort of he's not engaging. It's almost as if it's either he gets her problem and is just choosing to ignore it, which I have seen in real life with people, or he's just like blithely unaware. Maybe it's because I can't help but see Andrew Robinson as latently just very creepy. But there's always something about him that I've never considered. There's always something about him which doesn't stack up as purely nice. Well, which is why when he becomes Frank, he's tip top.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Was that I think in terms of the casting, they needed to pick someone who could competently play Larry, but also when he transforms into Frank and Larry's skin, you still feel that creepiness you're supposed to feel. You know what I mean? Like you wouldn't get like Tom Hanks in that.
No.
Yeah,
I think that Robinson is precisely right for the role, actually, because I think he he embodies as even though we differ on our opinions on him, he embodies so many nuanced, different elements of masculinity. Some good and some, I won't say bad in terms of toxic, but there's a certain weakness to him in certain elements, shall we say. Or perhaps it's an indecision, perhaps it's the scene where he rips his hand open as well as sort of the behavior around that. There are certain elements which, and I feel a little bit regressive saying it's not, I'm not saying it's super manly. You can absolutely be someone who's like freaks out by having what is effectively a massive rip through your hand.
Oh, totally,
But there's just a part of his personality that I could never quite, that stuck out to me as being ineffectual and lacking in something this time round, which, to be fair, is not there when he's talking with Kirsty, who he obviously adores. And those two have a very sweet relationship, and that's a really nice element of the film, this sort of very cute relationship between father and daughter. And I think that's a really nice part of it.
Yeah, I think the thing that maybe transforms, or how would I put this? The thing that leads my interpretation of his character and Kirsty and their relationship is the fact that his previous wife had died somehow. It comes up when one of the movers says like, "Oh, she looks like her mother," and he's like, "Her mother's dead." And because they have such a strong and what to me looks like a healthy and happy relationship,
it's very healthy.
Yeah, I kind of get the sense that maybe there's a level of trauma that's like hanging over him in a way.
Mm,
And so I think he's probably someone who's just desperate to have a happy life again, whatever that may look like. And I think,
mm,
unfortunately, he's just not matched up for Julia, right? Yeah. Like him and Julia they don't have chemistry. Like that's, to me, I don't look at it as like
no.
someone that doesn't, listen to her needs or anything. I look at it as someone who just doesn't click with this woman. He found a woman that he found was
Yes.
beautiful. And so I don't know. It's hard because I think hindsight is such a huge part of me, like going back into the film. I've seen it so many times. I know Julia is like quote unquote evil, right? So I can't help but look at
Mm,
her as someone who is maybe has taken advantage of this, widowed man. And there's a scene in the beginning that really stood out to me where
mm.
he's like, yeah, I think the house is great. And she's like, well, it's not as it's where she's like, it's better than Brooklyn. And
It's
she
better than
barely
Brooklyn.
says anything, but he goes, oh, don't start. And you kind of get the sense that I don't think he's reacting to what she's saying or doing in this moment. I think he's reacting to an accumulation of her behavior and her attitudes up to that point. That's kind of how I read that.
Yeah, no, I like that. I think that's a very charitable expression of his behaviour, and I think that's certainly I think that's the kinder way of looking at it than mine, which is perhaps a little bit blinkered by various biases on my own part and naivetes on my own part. But what is interesting is that again, we're returning to this concept. We've been talking about desire, and it's very interesting again how finally sadism is very much a textual element of a British horror
Yes.
film,
Yeah.
which of course is inspired by Barker's own understanding of S&M and queer culture as well, and the sort of leather culture that was that had a prevalency within 80s queer life. And you can definitely read Hellraiser as being a very queer film in the same way you can read Black Museum as being a very queer film. This was Hellraiser was produced the year before Section 28 was put in place, which basically prohibited any discussion of homosexuality in schools.
Wow. Okay.
There was a 15-year blanket ban on talking about it in the UK. And
sorry, when did that start? That started
that was 1988. So it's
1988.
Yeah, and it ends in 2003. 2003.
What? That's wild. Oh
well,
my god!
Again, this is the same government that gave us the video nasties. It was a very culturally conservative movement,
right?
And a very deeply, and I will say this, and this is not an attack against religion at all, but there was a very deeply Christian movement as well. It was conservative Christianity, effectively, and it was aligned to Reagan as well. Thatcher and Reagan were big buddies. But the reason I put all this spiel in place is because queer culture within it's fair to say, and I'm a straight guy, so I take what I say with a pinch of salt. But queer culture within Britain, and indeed in the world, I would say, was often very much an aggressive reaction to that heteronormativity. And so often it was more about these sorts of expressions of sexuality that had elements of pleasure and pain in them. And so what you get in Hellraiser is a film which is explicitly about the interconnection. Obviously, it's explicitly about pleasure, pain, sadism, masochism. And it's explored, but it's explored in a way where where the film is erotic, but the sex scenes and the violence is never eroticized, which is an important distinction because it's a very passionate film, but it's not a film where you. Bar, I think the sex scene between Julia and Frank,
right? I was going to say,
which is a great scene, but apart from that, there was sort of the attitude towards. How do I phrase? When I talk about sort of the erotics of it, I talk about the sex scenes themselves are notably incredibly sexy. They're very passionate and powerful and carnal, but the sequences where it is the torture, as it may be called, is never meant to be erotic. It never, to me, feels erotic, which admittedly I'm very vanilla.
Yeah.
But it always seems to be as much about the intensity of the pain. I'm sure somebody within the S&M community would be able to correct me on all of my assertions, and actually I'd really like to hear that.
Totally.
But it's a really interesting, I think, a bit Foucauldian, because it's the whole sort of limits of experience as conducted by a bold man sort of expression going on there. And Foucault famously was very interested in this sort of was a queer thinker himself. And so you get a film which is, aside from all of my half-baked waffling, is a film which is very interested in unearthing bits of British sexuality, universal sexuality, but also because Barker is a British writer, he was raised Catholic, which is often why there's a sort of very religious element to the film. It's in contact with a very specific British sexuality and a British release of desire. Frank, for example, being this sort of hedonistic pervert who, wants to go to the absolute ends of existence and the ends of sexuality, which sort of brings him almost in line with the Man in Grey, as I mentioned earlier. And you've got Julia, who is someone who is desiring and very obviously desiring, but has no outlet for it for whatever reason. And so you get this incredible interconnection, shall we say, of this release of energy, this release of desire in a way that is very powerful, I think, and very invigorating. I would say it's a beautiful film. It's one of the most beautiful films.
I think what it makes me think about is sort of like the power dynamics of like S&M, the power dynamics that can happen in these relationships. And with Frank, him wanting to go to the limits of experience, to go to the furthest ends of existence, as you say, I think maybe that's how Clive Barker is engaging with S&M here, is sort of saying like there within the S&M community, there's always this idea of consent. There's always this idea of like establishing safe word, right?
Yeah, the safe word and all that.
Yeah, exactly.
Very useful material that exists.
No matter what, there's this line that you don't cross. And I think to some extent there can be an excitement to people in that community, people that engage with that, of like, coming very close to that line, but knowing no matter what, you can't go past that line, because once you go past that line, you can't go back. You've done something like irreparable, Now, it was interesting looking at it as like Frank on one hand is like trying to keep going past those points, right? Meanwhile, you've got Julia, who's sort of on the opposite end in a way, where he's almost trying to completely pull her away from her morality. And that was something that really struck me about this viewing, was how even though she claimed she didn't love Larry, which I think goes into what I was saying earlier about how I think she's just really just using this man. She couldn't bring herself to kill him. It's still this idea that like, I still have this one chain to morality, to like that's stopping me from going to the complete the limits of existence,
And I think it's a case, and it's an interesting one. I think it's a case that she feels a certain sense of contempt for him. There's a level of contempt, but she also cannot deny that he's, in a number of ways, despite what I've sort of outlined as why I think that there's certain elements about him I don't like, he is also a decent individual. And I think there's a part of her which goes, the morality of doing away with him for the majority of the film is too much for her. And then I think it breaks through that last wall of repression, shall we say, the idea that she can have, because again, like a lot of British horror, it's about repression. It's about what the dangers of letting that go. And in this case, it's morality being used as a way to repress primal urges, deeper urges, shall we say, towards murder, towards lust, which is, again, it's something that occurs in every culture out there. But we're, again, in England, where there's a very specific, a very structured sort of order of the world. And Juliet has a British accent, which is, again, contrasted quite notably with the rest of the cast. I think maybe only a couple of other characters have British accents. They're mostly overdubbed.
Right.
Which again was part of what apparently New World were like. Yeah, we'll just dub it over and we'll make it look American. It doesn't.
Yeah.
It clearly looks like it's been shot in. I think it's shot. I don't know where it's shot. It might either be London or it might be Liverpool. I think.
Wait, I thought it took place in England, though.
Yeah, but this is the thing: is that apparently there was like some decision by New World to dub it over, and
right.
try and cadge it to make it look like it was in America. From what I read, I don't know if that's the case. All I know is that they give it a lot of American accent, and unless there's a massive American exclave community in London, there might be. There's so much about the accents in this film which rubs me up the wrong way. It's a very British concern. It's a very British concern. Like, you're not doing my voice right.
Right.
but it also doesn't quite. But even when that happens, it ruins one of, I think, the most interesting little interactions, which then works as a really good microcosm for the rest of the film, which is the scene where Kirsty and the boy she meets at the dinner party, who I don't think he's ever given a name. He's never given a name. He's just a man. They go home together, and she is teasing him about being English. And being very prim and proper, and says, "I beg your pardon," and he says it in an American accent. And if he'd said it in an English accent, there's the joke makes more sense, because it's about the idea that the English seem repressed and restrained and without desire. A better word. But there is all this bubbling up underneath, this sort of real intensity and passion, which, again, I think comes through in all of our horror films. There is a real sense of passion, of eroticism, such as it is. It's very different from continental eroticism, but it's a very hothouse eroticism. It's that sort of eroticism of, I don't know if I should be expressing this.
Oh, okay.
And that element doesn't really come through when it's dubbed as it is. It's the only fly in what is otherwise, I think, a pretty perfect ointment.
Well, it's funny you say the fly, because I do like this element, but I still don't understand how the homeless man works into the film. The one that keeps eating the bugs.
I don't get it. No, I don't get it.
Okay, I like it though. I do.
I do. I think it's a denizen of hell. I think it's a denizen of hell, similar to the creature that we see in the cavernous corridor, who is there to effectively collect the. But it's not called this in the film, but it's the lamentation configuration is now what it's known as. So I'm just remembering a friend of mine has a T-shirt with the configuration on. It's fantastic.
Oh, cool. Yeah, you just reminded me. There's a scene in Plague of the Zombies where I don't know if maybe you know this or you caught this, but they look down at I think it's the main character, the guy who travels to Cornwall.
Yeah, the doctor. Yeah.
Yeah, he looks down at a desk. Sir James. He looks down at a desk, and there's a mat on the desk that looks like, one square of the lament configuration.
I did not realize that. But
I saw that. I was like, what? That's crazy.
in an alternate universe, the two films cross over.
Well, I thought maybe that's how you connected them or something.
No. I'd love that to be the case. But no, the lament configuration, or the lamentation, I think it is the lament configuration. The idea is that it's brought back to its original owner, who is the seller. And then the whole cycle begins again. And you can read it as a sort of a parable of being tested, of desires being tested. and sort of almost a sort of there's a satanic element to it, shall we say, in terms of they are denizens of hell, and they're explicitly called denizens of hell. So again, Bach is operating with his religious background.
Yeah, I think the satanic element is really interesting to me because the Cenobites never appear. They are evil. We can agree, are evil, right? But
within this film, yes, absolutely.
Right, but there's some level of order to them, and from what I've read of the Satanic Bible, I've read some stuff by Anton LaVey and everything, and say what you will about Satanism, but they do have rules in place, and they basically they don't believe in harming anyone unless they've been harmed. It's yay revenge, but you don't go out of your way to be cruel to someone. Like, what's the point?
Yeah,
and that's sort of that play with the Cenobites,
I was going to agree with you on that, so I jumped in. But yes, I agree. I think there is something to that in the Cenobites, which is that they are the line that I think it's Crowley once said is "Do what thou wilt." Is vaguely what I remember as being the original. Is like his maxim. And there is something to be said for that in the Cenobites as figures who allow individuals to do what they will in terms of their own search for sexual pleasure, shall we say, or search for the limit of sensation. But the thing is that they are so utterly desensitized to extremity that they just they have no concept of restraint, and so it's just full out, ripping people to shreds.
Right. Okay.
I mean, they call themselves explorers they call themselves explorers, I'm pretty sure, when Doug Bradley first appears as Pinhead.
Okay.
And so there's an element there of, it's not, we were talking about killing for the hell of killing. This is not that. This is very much refining the art. Which is what I see in Peeping Tom. Come to think of it, it's a very critical opinion of violence, a very critical opinion of atrocity, effectively, and horror and fear, and instilling that in others. And so I think it is concordant. But also, I must say that I think Doug Bradley in this is. The sequence where he gives his monologue, and it's the "We'll tear your soul apart." I'm still blown away by that scene at just how strong a performance it is. It's resonant, it's commanding, it's perfectly expressed. He is just the most amazing, and it's done with Christopher Young's score, with those incredible sort of chiming chords. Which feel like church bells, and I think that's deliberate. I mean, it's as soon as the bells go and the walls go black, that is one of the most sustained 2 or 3 moments, right up to "We'll tear your soul apart." One of the most brilliant sequences, I think, in a horror film is just how incredibly it brings out the mission statement. It establishes the sensation of the moment. It is glorious. It is gorgeous. And that's why I think that Hellraiser is a beautiful film, because I think that it manages to turn very intense sexuality and what could be considered nasty or repulsive or gritty into high art. And I think in that respect, it's it's a rare film and a very beautiful film and a very British film at that.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked it for this podcast because I never really thought of it as a British film before, you picking it and putting it on this list. I guess, I lump it in with all the other slashers, which all are, for the most part, American. I guess I never really thought about it too deeply as being outside of an American slasher. But
I think the thing is that after film 2, Barker basically rescinds any interaction with the franchise, because he
Yeah.
continues the Cenobites exploring their lore, but in his own works. And he's continued to do that pretty much until the present day. I'm not sure if he's still working. I know he wasn't very well fairly recently. In the last couple of years, he was very unwell. So it went in two very different directions. One which was more perhaps faithful to the original intention of Barker, which was to make, I'd say, horror for adults, really.
Yeah.
And it's horror for adults in a way that I think goes beyond, say, King, who obviously recognizes Barker as one of the greats, but I think it goes beyond that level of maturity into something a lot more morally complicated, aesthetically rich and nuanced. And whenever I think of Barker, I do think of this sort of consummate artist who is operating in so many different modes and forms of expression, and is constantly refining, is using these very refined points of reference. Wild is another one. He did a version of Salome as a short film. He brings all these various elements together, magicianry, for example, to create this incredibly unique but incredibly powerful, from what little I know of him, world. So I think that's incredibly. And I would also, one that I do recommend from his books that I've read, Cabal, which obviously became Nightbreed, but is a really impressive. Nightbreed. Cabal is a really good book. It's a very moving book. And Abarat. Is, he made a collection of, it's like a sort of a fantasy series. There were 4 of them. Abarat is the first. I was given a first edition copy of it at one point. I don't know where it is now, but it has his own ink drawings in it.
Oh wow!
As illustrations, and it's a brilliant book. But yeah, this is a really it's a consummate, as I say, consummate artist operating in these wonderfully dark fields and very unpleasant fields in places, but always with a distinct purpose and a distinctly serious attitude that is never about provocation for provocation's sake, which is what Hellraiser also is. Very serious.
Yeah. Have you seen any of the Hellraiser sequels?
Well, because it's Hooptober coming up, I actually have one of the sequels finally on my list. Okay. For me, I've seen Hellraiser now 4 times.
Okay.
I like to spread it out a bit, because I like to. Some things for me rest well in the memory, and then I like to occasionally return to them, like one might a good bottle of wine. And for me, Hellraiser was one of them, and I felt that watching the others, I wouldn't say would cheapen it, but it just never came to mind. It was like, if it's not going to be what I have here, then there's no interest for it.
Interesting.
Which I know is a bit of a reductive approach to the films.
Some might say, yeah.
but they might legitimately say that, actually. And this is one of the things I'm trying to do more recently, is really sort of get past my old prejudices, I suppose, on certain horror franchises and horror expressions, and kind of just seeing for myself. So Hellraiser 2 is now on there, and I'm very much looking forward to it. If nothing, to see what Julia is like in the second film, and see where things go.
Amazing. Oh, she's so good in the second one.
She's a wonderful actress. I mean, she's a wonderful actress in the first one, but I hear she's even better in the second one in terms of her character.
That's good. I don't know if Frank is in the second one, but Julia is like kind of Frank's role in the second one. The second one is also a direct sequel too. I think it picks up immediately after. Like I think it spends most of its time in the hospital. But yeah, I think you'll like the second one. Maybe like if you give Hellraiser 5, you might give the second one 4, kind of thing. Okay. I'm a big fan of the third one, but it is very silly. There's a Cenobite in it that has like a camera, and then there's a Cenobite that has like a CD player on its head. It's super zany, but it's directed by Anthony Hickox, who is I love a lot of his films. Yeah, he did like Waxworks, and he also did another zany sequel I love, Warlock 2.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
I think,
Have you seen Warlock 2?
No, I've not even seen the original Warlock. This is the thing. There's a lot of what the really up on horror people on Letterboxd love. Warlock, Waxwork, all this sort of like material. I mean, I only saw Return of the Living Dead for the first time last month. I'm really yeah, I know. This is the thing. I'm really new
Ethan,
to some of this.
Better late than never. That's what I say.
Well, this is the thing. That's also the thing, is that there's a certain element where I'm like, I do. What I think for me for watching films is much as like is an exploration. It's a pleasurable odyssey into the different. Which is why if you look at my letterbox, you'll see very few films which are, well, I wouldn't say very few, but I do often watch new films to myself rather than rewatches. I rarely rewatch films unless it's a long, long time, or it's for a project such as for this. And the reason for this is because I feel that there is so much out there that I've not yet seen. British, American, Italian, whatever, giallo, slasher, documentary, mondo film, whatever you may want, horror or otherwise, that for me, I feel like I want to keep pushing and I want to keep expanding.
I'm the same way. And I go, like I very rarely rewatch stuff. Well, I will sometimes just for like a comfort thing, but if you follow me on Letterboxd, you'll see I don't really write multiple reviews of films unless it's been quite a few years, unless I feel like I want to raise the rating for it or something. But otherwise, I just feel like I need to keep exploring. As you say, there's so much out there, and I get very fixated on certain styles or certain decades or certain, at this point, like Japan has been kind of pulling my interest this past year. So I feel like there's so many amazing Japanese films that I'm stumbling on, and it's just
I mean, Radiance are doing a box set of Dai horror films very soon, including The Snow Witch.
Okay, cool.
Which promises to be exceptional. Which obviously, again, it's the Kwaidan Gothic era of Japanese horror, which
I don't know much about, actually. Yeah, I need to see those.
It's beautiful films, very, very beautiful films. There are lots of sort of, I think Kanato Shindo did a number of them.
Okay.
Yeah, but you were also the person who introduced me to a film I saw this month as of recording, which was The Shadowed Mind, which was a South African,
South African
sort of like giallo experimental psychodrama thing. Yeah. And that was a real pleasure to watch. And again, one of the reasons why I follow a lot of people on Letterboxd, and one of the reasons is because I like to see a lot of different opinions on things, but I also, there's a lot of films I don't know or I would not have gotten to. And I do think that being on Letterboxd and interacting with the communities I have has pushed me to see as much as I have and to really expand myself. And I think that is, that's what I derive the most pleasure from when it comes to horror in particular, which is
I agree.
Effectively my métier now.
Yeah. We should probably wrap it up. We're going over 2 hours now, so it's getting long here. But I'll get the questionnaire going in a minute, but was there anything else you wanted to add about British horror? Or okay.
One thing I will say, and this is more not to the British listeners, but I would like to make the case that to the international listeners, that while British horror may seem somewhat musty and a little staid, or it may have a few small elements that you may find interesting, I do genuinely encourage you to search out the history of British horror cinema, because it is a great deal of what is now loved in Italian cinema, in American cinema, comes from the Brits. It comes from Hammer. It comes from Amicus. We gave the world Cushing and Lee. We can produce films that are as bleak and as dark as the Monk, most of them, including the Pete Walker films. We've made comedies. We've made a whole raft of different things, which are all united by this very distinct interest in repression, in sexuality is an overwhelming and quite scary concept, and this idea of sort of a very strong sense of desire that has been chained, and it's about gradually pulling the chains away. And at our best, we make films. We make some of the best horror films in the world, and I'd say I'm biased, but I believe that. And I think that when we are talking about repression like Hellraiser, very few can touch the brilliance of a British horror. So that's my little pitch that's my nationalist pitch.
I love it. No, I love that. I'll put up a little, British flag for you.
It's just a pause and then just God Save the King starts playing.
Which, the Sex Pistols or?
Dealer's choice.
Okay. Two things just want to say in regards to British horror, British film in general, but to me, I've always thought that British horror, like folk horror, is the best. Britain is the best at folk horror. Yeah. We haven't even really talked about
folk. Well, we've not talked about folk horror because folk horror increasingly is such a popular part of the British understanding. The Wicker Man, Blood on Satan's Claw, the M.R. James films in particular. They are, again, some of the greatest, and because we have an understanding, I think, of deep time.
Yes.
We're an old country, really. We're an old country that's steeped in mystic tradition, trauma, heritage, in a way that gives us this really complex understanding of ritual and faith, I would argue. And faith obviously comes up in Hellraiser. But the British folk horror is such, especially the older British folk horror, it's so rich and complex and I highly recommend it. And not British, but I would also recommend an Irish film. An Irish director is McCarthy, who did Oddity this year, which is very much worth your time.
Yeah, I've been hearing really cool things about that. It's Irish, you say? Okay.
Yes, it's Irish, and that's a very important distinction to make. Important distinction to make.
Sure. Yeah. Oddity. Yeah. No, I'll put up the poster and people, I'm sure, I think it's coming out to Shudder soon. So,
I believe it is. Yes. It's had a small theater run in the US.
I did want to talk about Alan Clark because I've gotten super into Alan Clark this year.
Let's do it.
Oh, we can briefly mention it. Hour. Okay,
we'll briefly mention that if you want to talk about British horror and Alan Clark, the one to talk about is Pender's Fen, which I don't think of as a horror film. I think it is a folk mystical tale. But Clark is another example of a director who operated outside the I won't say the studio system, but worked out outside the feature film system. He was a TV play director.
Yeah.
And he did things like The Road, he did Scum, he did The Firm. And I think you'll agree I'd say he's probably one of our best. Right up there, right at the top in terms of British filmmakers.
I saw Elephant because I read a review of In a Violent Nature from Louise Ward where she compared In a Violent Nature to Friday 13th Part 2 meets Elephant.
It's
spot on. Very good. So I sought out Elephant, was like, this is incredible. And then I watched Scum, and then I watched Made in Britain, and then I watched The Firm. And, those aren't horror films by any means, but they feel somewhat adjacent to me, maybe because of the brutal violence and the disturbing content.
And the despair, I would say.
Yeah.
A lot of these films are about a very distinct English despair, usually a working class despair, at a system that is a system that's failed them. The squire and his lot of Plague of the Zombies has won. And I mean, films like Road, for example, is set in a northern mining town, which was famously decimated in the 80s when all the mines were closed. And it's just streets of boarded up houses. There's no jobs. There's nothing.
Oh, wow.
And so these are horror films more like Apaches in terms of they are the horrors of the everyday. Well, there's not a sort of a
Right.
cautionary tale message behind them, but it's that very, again, it's in the social realist field. Yeah, I can't believe we didn't talk about Clark or folk horror, but those are almost episodes on their own. To be honest, they're episodes on their own to do British folk horror.
I know.
Because you
That's
could
why
get
it's like,
there's a real richness of material. But so if anyone
yeah.
wants that, leave a comment.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing, Ethan. Like, we are in touch, so I would love to get you back on next season.
I'd love to be back if you'd like.
Yeah, it'll be easy to do, and we have 2 possible subjects here, but
Excellent.
maybe we should also steer away from England and pick something that maybe we're both a little unfamiliar with. So
let's talk about it. Let's talk about it later. But now,
yes.
Your questionnaire.
The questionnaire.
I'm dying to answer. As a former quizzer, I'm dying to answer questions.
Okay. Tea or coffee?
Coffee. Originally, I would have been tea.
Right.
For a long time, I was tea, but I've developed a taste for coffee more as I've gotten older.
I think it might have to do with a certain PhD, possibly, where you need a little more caffeine.
Yeah, well, that was entirely done on Coca-Cola. Okay. I didn't really get into coffee until the last year and so, and it was even now it's still just iced coffee because I'm weak. But I like. There's something I know it's pathetic, but
not really.
There's something the bitterness of the taste I think appeals more than it did prior. But yeah, I drank tea a lot when I was doing my PhD as well. I'd have a cup of morning tea out of one of 3 different mugs.
Oh, okay. Okay. Choose one film for the rest of your life.
The Shining.
Great. You came up with that so fast too. That's awesome. Okay.
Yeah. It has to be.
Oh, it's I do wonder if that's maybe my favorite film of all time.
Same.
It's phenomenal.
Nothing touches me quite like it.
Yeah. If you had to be an animal, which would you choose?
The capybara.
Oh, wow. That's a new one. Yeah, capybara. Okay, I think I know what that is. Yeah.
They are. So my friend and I are big fans of this animal. A friend of mine. I've actually gone and petted them. They are they're very relaxed. They're very calm. They have very little that they need to do within life, except sort of walk around, eat vegetables, and sort of sit, and occasionally swim. And I think as somebody who's very head orientated and has always been that way, something wherein it's mostly just relaxation. Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah. You know what? That's something, it's a very common thing when people answer that question is that everyone always picks something that's like, oh, if I change myself into this animal, I can just relax and I can sleep or whatever, you know?
Which I think is a sign of the world we live in, is one as being so mechanized and so about work and consumption that it's the desire for leisure and the desire for complete opting out of the system is quite strong, I'd say.
Yes, yeah, absolutely right.
Hence the humble capybara.
Yes. Okay, what happens when we die?
I don't know.
Okay, that's fair.
I don't know, but I would like to think it's more than the light being turned off. Without doubt, I would like to think it's that. I think that's a natural human response to be interested in wanting something to beyond this mortal coil. And I think also there is an idea of non-consciousness, of eternal sleep, shall we say, which is, I think, latently quite terrifying because so much of your life is spent within the conscious walls of your head. To suddenly be without that is very unsettling. So ideally, I would like somewhere.
Okay.
I think I would like somewhere wherein it would be an afterlife of some description. And I think I would like to think that I would have the humility, if a deity was in fact in control of that afterlife, I would have the humility to go to them. I was wrong. Okay. I was wrong. So, yeah.
And then they say, well, thank you for admitting you're wrong. You're going to hell.
Pulse trapdoor. Well,
Yeah,
if
exactly.
that was, I mean, if that was the, well, yeah, that's always the thing. I think at some point I'd have to. I mean, then we move into questions of the sense of divine grace and sort of what is considered a worthy life, what is considered a good life, and what
yeah,
and how one quantifies that, and within a various number of strictures, really, and
yeah.
that's something obviously that has occurred to me increasingly over the past year or so. I would say it's become more of a subject of interest to me. So yeah, that's my long-winded answer to your very short question.
Great. It's a big question if you think about
it. It is. It's a huge question.
Okay, this is the last question. Song title that best describes your life.
There have been many over the years,
mm-hmm.
but one that I think actually works, and the one that came to mind first, and it's a bit of a joke one, but it kind of works, and it's The Great Pretender, which obviously was the Platters. And it's a very melancholy song, even though it's a sort of an upbeat pop tune. But I think it speaks to a fact that at a point in my life, I really didn't know who I was. I had very limited understanding of self, but I knew something didn't quite fit. And this is something I talk about in my I Saw the TV Glow review, which you can go and read. But it's always the line, my needs are such, I pretend too much, I'm lonely but no one can tell. And that for me was very much a profound part of my existence, I think, prior to diagnosis and understanding, which happily has now abated quite significantly in the past few years. But I think that line, that song still, I think that's the one that I would describe me. But I think the other one I like is another very sentimental 50s tune. It's Que Sera Sera, which I think is a good life motto to have. And it's, again, a beautifully rhythmic song, very simple, very direct. Yeah. So I think that to describe myself, it is the Platters' Great Pretender.
The Platters. I almost want to say, are they like a ska band?
They are a doo-wop group.
Doo-wop. Okay, my bad.
Doo-wop. So if you've seen either Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant or American Graffiti, their music appears in that a couple of times. The other one they're well known for is Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, which is another tremendous song.
Which is in your eyes, huh?
Yeah, which is originally I think it's a Jerome Kern song originally, but it's been reinterpreted multiple times. Okay,
cool. So yeah, The Great Pretender.
Yes.
The Platters. Okay, cool.
Yes.
Otherwise, Que Sera Sera, which is by
Doris Day.
Doris Day. Okay. Sounds good. Yeah. Okay.
very, very, very different to horror today.
I find that's pretty common. And I mean, what would the music be for a horror fan necessarily? Well, I guess death metal or something.
This is the thing, and I think this is a good way we can end this episode. It's something I've noticed about a number of the people who have come onto your podcast. We were talking about this before we started, but your most recent episode at the time of recording was Kelly. Now, Kelly obviously has a really, really interesting appreciation for extreme horror. And what struck me was also the very moral, the very distinct moral code that she operates in, and a very admirable one as a vegan, as someone who's very concerned about the animal cruelty, who is very obviously a feminist, who considers things within social movements you and I would consider we agree with, I would say.
Totally.
And what I find is that there is within, I think, a number of people who enjoy more extreme expressions of cinema, whether it's horror, whether it's the extreme cinemas of people like Vogel or Dora are often quite moral in themselves. There is a distinct moral understanding of of situations and life, and are using cinema in these sorts of cinemas as a way to either define their own limits, to understand within, again, the reaches of the furthest reaches of human experience, much as with Hellraiser.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are those who are less pleasant in that realm, as I think with all groups. But what I was struck by was the sort of the very real honesty and sort of openness of her, and indeed a number of the guests you've had on as well. And I think that speaks a lot to the way horror can be consumed.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, and to kind of also double back a bit, it did make me think about what I was saying about exploitation cinema from the past, how it was willing to kind of bring up these subjects because it was willing to talk about them. And I think maybe that's what's kind of going on here with extreme horror is just a willingness to talk about things that maybe people are just trying to act like it doesn't exist, and that maybe that's not the most healthy thing,
No, I agree.
Yeah.
And it's usually, and the last thing I'll say is it's usually the ones who are the most censorious about such material who have usually got the most to hide. Let's be honest.
Exactly. Yeah, 100%. Yes. Well said. Okay, Ethan, thank you so much for your time. This was a wonderful episode. You will be back.
Pleasure.
We'll be in touch. Yes, and have a nice day.
Thank you. And I'll be the same to everybody.
Okay. Take care.
Take care.